Hello class, welcome to the flipped instruction video on Civil War economics. In this video we're going to go over some dominant theories on economics in relation to the Civil War and the effects of the Civil War on the US economy, and we'll also go a little bit deeper into a couple of core economic concepts that'll be important to know. Now, I'm going to start this off with a question that we're going to go over more in class, but I kind of want you guys to think about it now a little bit, just in your own head, and maybe just kind of rattle it around. And the question is this: do you think a war is good for an economy? And if so, why do you think it's good for an economy? Now, there are many instances in history where historians and economists in general have trumpeted war as being good for an economy, especially for the side that wins the war. The best example of this in the US obviously would be World War II. It's always been perceived as the war that got us out of the Great Depression, got America back to work in the factories, everyone kind of galvanized by the war efforts and really just pushing America forward as the world superpower. And for the first half of the 20th century, that was also the dominant view of the Civil War. And the dominant theory of that was the Beard-Hacker thesis, developed by Charles Beard and Lewis Hacker. Now, Beard and Hacker contended that the Civil War was the second American Revolution, in that it shifted power away from the southern plantations and into the northern factories. It also led us down a path to industrialization that would end up defining the last 30 years or so of the 19th century. And Charles Beard even called it, the Civil War, a triumph of industrial capitalism. His biggest argument for this was that America was no longer reliant on the supply-demand elements of cotton. Prior to the Civil War, cotton was the dominant U.S. commodity. We produced, I believe, 70% of the world's cotton, and it was our most dominant export to other countries. Supply and demand are core economic concepts depicting the transaction relationship between businesses and consumers, with supply being the aspect of it that's controlled by businesses, and demand being the aspect that's controlled by consumers. Now, supply is defined as the quantity of a product that a business is willing to produce at different prices. The accompanying law of supply dictates that if all other factors remain equal, if the price goes up, the quantity goes up. And if the price goes down, the quantity goes down. Now, if you think about it from a business perspective, if you're a business that is producing something and selling it to a consumer, if the price of the sale to the consumer is higher, you're going to be more apt to produce more because you're making more money. Whereas if the price is lower, you're probably not going to want to produce as much because you're not making as much money. Now, in contrast, demand is the quantity of a product that consumers are willing to buy at different prices. And the accompanying law of demand is in fact an inverse relationship. Whereas if the price goes up, the quantity is going to go down, and if the price goes down, the quantity is going to go up. Now, that one's a little bit easier to think about as a high school student or just as a general consumer. Like say you go into a yo-yo shop and the price of the yo-yo has gone way up. Maybe you won't want to buy a yo-yo. Maybe you'll go into a different shop and spend your money elsewhere. Now, in order to illustrate this, I've got a graph here that's going to be for supply, a graph that's going to be for demand, and then a graph that's going to combine the two together. Now, looking at this with the P being price and the Q being quantity, supply goes up for both of them. With price going up, quantity goes up. Good way to think about it is supply goes to the sky. Now, on the flip side, we've got demand, which again is an inverse relationship, whereas if price drops, the quantity goes up. Now, taking those two combined into one graph, we've got our supply line going up, and we've got our demand going this way. Now, the intersecting point of those is the sweet spot in the market known as market equilibrium. Now that is when the market is operating at optimum efficiency. Now, if you fall above or below that line, you have a market inefficiency. If you are above that line, you have an excess of supply and a deficit in demand. And if the market is lower than that equilibrium, you have an excess of demand, but you have a deficit of supply. After World War II, many economists began to disagree with the beard hacker thesis. One of the leading voices of this was economic historian Stanley Liebergoat. Liebergoat contended that the Civil War stalled U.S. industrialization for three main reasons. The first one was that the loss of both human and physical capital during the Civil War was too tremendous to ignore from an economic standpoint. Now, to go over the quick definitions of those, physical capital are the physical tools that a person would need to produce a product, whereas human capital are the mental abilities and intangible talents that a person possesses for making said product. A good example of this would be for a painter. Now, the paintbrush, the paint, and the canvas would be considered the physical capital of that, whereas the painter's artistic ability and their own mental sensibilities for it would be the human capital of that. Now, the second reason for it was that many people from the civilian labor force were diverted into the military. Roughly 1 in 4 men during that time period served in the Civil War, and without the war, many of those people would have been instead employed in the civilian economy, producing goods and services that actually did not end up being produced because they were fighting in the war. The third reason for this was that investments were diverted from the civilian economy into a military economy. An example of this would be money that was spent to produce uniforms and bullets. Now, that money could have been spent to produce something along the lines of clothing and farming equipment. Now, those bullets and uniforms do have value still, but they're value that are only recognized in a military setting. Anything outside of the military, they don't really have the same amount of value. Now, taking all of those three reasons into account, they all add up to a huge opportunity cost suffered from the Civil War by both the North and the South. Opportunity cost is a core economic concept that kind of seems imposing at first, but when you really stop to think about it, is actually pretty straightforward and simple. The basic definition of it is that it is the second best option given up in favor of whatever the first option may be for something. Using the Civil War as an example, say a Northerner goes and joins the Union Army during the war, whereas during that time he could have been working in a factory or getting an education or being with his family. Those things that he could have been doing would be considered the opportunity cost in that. Or, kind of taking modern life into an example, you can think about it like if you decide to go to a movie instead of deciding to, say, go to the library and study. Now, the option of going to the library and studying would be considered the opportunity cost of going to the movie if you just have those two options and nothing else. Now, it's a core economic concept because everything in life has an opportunity cost. Whatever decision you make, the next best option is the opportunity cost. Now, it's a pretty basic concept in that regard. In order to illustrate it, we're going to do what's called a production possibilities curve. Now, a production possibilities curve is the potential production of two different products at various different production scenarios, provided the factory or whatnot that is producing that is operating at an efficient level. So, in order to illustrate that scenario, we're going to pretend that I'm able to retire from teaching and then reside to a life of producing either yo-yos or books. Now, in production scenario A, I'm able to produce 30 yo-yos to 0 books if everything is operating efficiently. In scenario B, I'm able to reduce 25 yo-yos to 5 books. Scenario C, 15 to 10, D, 5 to 20, and then E, we have it reversed, where I'm able to reduce 30 books to 0 yo-yos. Now, this is the chart showing those, and that doesn't really show much of a curve. I mean, I'm not seeing a curve there. So what I did was I created a graph for it, and these are the various points, A, B, C, D, E. Now the curve would be to connect all of those points. So start here, down, and to that point. So that green line right there is my production possibilities curve. And anything produced underneath that green line right here would be considered an inefficiency or an inefficient use of resources. Now you're probably wondering at this point, what the heck does production possibility have to do with opportunity costs? Well, we're going to actually run through these to try to figure out what the opportunity cost of going from one scenario to another is. So, the opportunity cost of going from A to C, for example. At A, for the scenario, we're producing 30 yo-yos to 0 books. And then in C, we've got, I'll just write it here, 30 in A, and then 30 in 0, and then 15 in 10. Okay, so going from A to C, you produce more books, so it's not really an opportunity cost. What you're giving up, though, is the number of yo-yos. So you do 30 minus 15, which equals 15. And then we'll do the example going the other direction, going from D, where you're producing 5 yo-yos to 20 books, and then going to D, or going to B, where you've got 25 yo-yos to 5 books. Oh, and that's obviously yo-yos. Alright, so looking at this, you're producing more yo-yos, so that's not really the opportunity cost, you're not giving anything up there, but you are giving up books. So you do 20 minus 5, which equals 15 books. So in summation, the opportunity cost of going from scenario A to C is 15 yo-yos. The opportunity cost of going from D to B is 15 books.